Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Sean Griffiths.
And if you are one of the majority of Americans who does not sit squarely in Team Red or Team Blue, welcome home. And you might have heard that the 2024 presidential race is really tight. And you might have heard that because the only thing news coverage seems to be talking about are the polls. Sean and I are going to take a dive into the dearth of topics not related to the horse race. But first, we've got a few stories we want to chat about with you. The first thing that actually popped up, Sean, in my newsfeed today would be considered weird in any other time other than 2024, which is David Duke, former KKK. I believe he was a Grand Wizard. Am I correct there? Was he a Grand Wizard? I don't know.
I just know he was in the KKK.
He was very active in the KKK.
Right.
Has endorsed Jill Stein, Green Party candidate. Now, of course, I've got first thing I thought, Sean, was it's a really confusing time to be a Nazi in America, right? When one of your stalwart leaders is endorsing someone with the last name Stein. But the interesting thing is that the Democratic Party has been playing this up. And so the Democratic Party has been talking about, hey, now the KKK has endorsed Jill Stein. And obviously this gets into the deep-seated Democratic fear that the Green Party is going to take enough votes away from Kamala Harris that it could potentially tilt the election. I don't know if you have any thoughts on Duke's groundbreaking endorsement, Sean.
I mean, I do find it interesting that he says it's because of the war in the Middle East and the actions that Israel has taken against Palestinians, because I can't imagine he really cares about Palestinians, given that he is a white supremacist. So it's very strange, but also, I mean, other than that, I don't really know what to say about this endorsement. Although I did see Stein's response, at least to her credit, unlike Trump, she was willing to say no, like, I do not accept this endorsement at all from him. However, she immediately made it an excuse to just attack Kamala Harris. And her endorsement from Dick Cheney that she says that she brags a lot about, but I never hear Kamala Harris mention Dick Cheney. I hear her mention Liz Cheney a lot, sure, and is even campaigned with Liz Cheney, but not Liz's father.
Yeah, it's kind of funny the way this is an excuse for everybody to snipe at each other.
Right.
And I would agree with you too, David Duke, like pick a lane, man. My favorite part about the article, I picked this one up from Newsweek. My favorite part was there was a quote that said, the Harris and Trump campaigns have been contacted for further comment via email outside business hours. And I just thought, is that like, I mean, you're the journalist of the two of us. Like, is that?
No, that's like, if it's outside business hours, first of all, if it's outside business hours, I'm not working, but hopefully election season, that's different. But also like, if you're a journalist, you contact someone within business hours and you phone them.
Yeah.
If you really want to comment from them, especially on a story like this, you don't send their campaign an email. And I get it. Like some journals, like I'm not the biggest person. I don't like being on the phone that much. I don't. But if I have a job to do and I need direct contact with somebody, I'm calling them for comment.
Yeah. I never expect to read the New York Times and be like, well, I left him a voicemail, I mean, so whatever. It's Newsweek. They used to be a magazine. I don't know what they're doing now. All right. So second interesting story, Michael Bennett, the Democratic senator from Colorado, has come out against Proposition 131. This is something we talked about in the last episode. This would replace Colorado's current system of elections with a top four primary system. And again, if you've listened to this podcast before, you know that top four is different in the sense that it replaces partisan primaries with an open primary. All candidates compete for voters in all parties. Top four vote getters make it on the ballot, and the general election is determined by ranked choice voting.
You know what? The only thing I will say is what we continue to see from these states that have these type of initiatives on the ballot is the party that has the most to lose from a nonpartisan system is generally the one that will come out against this, because it's a very party centric mindset of, well, how does this system affect my chances of winning, rather than, well, does this system actually reflect what the will of voters are? And that's
Mhm.
ultimately what is important to a lot of these lawmakers at the end of the day, is winning one for their team. And if they see that their team has the least to benefit from reform, then they'll come out against it.
Agreed. And this is notable because in Colorado right now, the Democrats are the largest party in terms of registration, but they only have 27% of all voters. So 24% are Republican and 47% are independent. When we talk about retaining partisan primaries, what we're talking about is preserving dominance for the majority party in a given state. And it is interesting that Bennett, a Democrat, is coming out against this. First and foremost, because I'd say the Democrats have been the warmest to electoral reforms like ranked choice voting, top four voting, and so on. But part two is it's the primary system in Colorado that has allowed Lauren Boebert, one of the most extreme Republicans in Congress, to get elected. And I'm going to walk through a few of her elections to tell you exactly how. So 2020, she runs for Congress in District 3. This is a district with a Republican lean of 6% at the time, according to the Cook Partisan Voting Index. So very safe Republican seat. Now, she wins her first primary with a little over half of all Republican voters in the Republican primary. So about 59,000 votes. That's 13% of the total votes that would be cast in the general election. Now, again, I want to just hone in on that number because this is a safe Republican district. So that 13% of voters effectively guaranteed her victory in the general election. Now, despite the partisan lean of the district, she won with a little over 51% of the vote. This was 2020. There was obviously a big anti Trump backlash that could probably have suppressed the Republican vote, but still not a huge majority for such a partisan district. Now, 2022 has a more comfortable lead in the primary, but almost loses the general election by 546 votes. This is 2022. This was supposed to be the age of the red wave, right? Of course, that didn't happen. 546 votes in a district with a 6% Republican advantage. So now she's gotten the impression that she's not all that popular in her district, so she moves. And now, 2024, she's living in District 4. Ken Buck, the former representative, has resigned. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And this district has a Republican lean of 13%. So it's possible even she won't be able to screw this one up. But she won that district's Republican primary in a six-way race with 43% of Republican voters, or just a little under 44%. So the majority of Republicans in that district don't even want her there.
Mm.
So how would this differ under Proposition 131? Well, Boebert would not be able to rely on a partisan primary to launch her to victory. She would most likely be one of four candidates, probably running against another Republican, probably running against a Democrat, maybe an independent. And because the results of that election are determined by ranked choice voting, she couldn't just appeal to her partisan base. So she'd have to appeal to a wider swath of voters in order to get elected. And again, I find this really interesting because for all the Democrats talk about the dangers of MAGA Republicans, we have a reform which is already proven in Alaska to disadvantage MAGA Republicans not being implemented in a state with one of the most MAGA Republicans around.
Yeah, I do find it interesting. And when you look at her old district, you look at the voter registration, and much like the state, there's a lot of independents in that district. So now that you have this pretty much open seat in that district for it, you'll see this opportunity that Democrats have to pick up a seat in Congress. And in this next seat, in the seat that she moved into, under a nonpartisan system, it could potentially benefit Democrats as well, depending on, what voter turnout looks like.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And to your point, the one thing that I think a lot of voters would care about is getting the more extreme and more fringe candidates out and moving more toward a more center aligned candidate who has broad appeal. And we saw it in Alaska with both Lisa Murkowski and Mary Peltola that the more moderate candidate in 2022 won. The person who was willing to exist more in the center because they got enough independents, enough Democrats, and enough Republicans to win.
And even you look at a state like Maine, which has ranked choice voting, very similar setup. You have a very moderate Republican senator. You have a very moderate Democratic representative, in this case, Jared Golden. And I think Jared Golden and Peltola are two of the only pro-gun rights Democrats in the caucus, or if there are more, there aren't many. I think what's interesting about Boebert's new district too is that it was recently vacated by Ken Buck. And Buck was conservative for sure, but he also decided not to seek reelection due to the fact that he felt his party had just gone totally batty with their embrace of election denialism. Second part is he left Congress because he didn't think it was a place where he could affect change anymore. And he's not the only one. So we had a bunch of retirements. There was Earl Blumenauer of Oregon, a Democrat, Debbie Lesko, Republican from Arizona, Brian Higgins, Democrat of New York. All of them explicitly cited dysfunction in Congress as their reason for leaving.
And what's interesting about that is that the New York Times did exit interviews for all of these retiring members of Congress, and they all did, like you said, they all cited how broken it is. And these are the very people who operate within the system who know the system is broken. And yet, oftentimes, they will also endorse the very election models that have led to the system being as broken as it is today. And they ultimately say, and this is kind of the thing that you roll your eyes at and scoff at, is that they say, well, ultimately, it's up to voters to change this. It's up to voters. And for half the states in the country, voters do have this option where they could put citizen ballot initiatives on the ballot and reform the elections process for half the states. The other half, such laws have to go through the legislature. And then you have to try to pass these type of comprehensive reforms with the very people who benefit from the status quo as it is. But it's also, these people also make election rules. They make policies that affect how elections are conducted. So to put this entirely on voters and say, well, the voters will fix this is it's like I said, it makes you roll your eyes.
Yeah. Well, the voters will fix it, but then you have state legislators standing in the way of those fixes.
Right.
So, of course, Colorado, we talked about this last episode. Democratic state representative wrote a clause in a much broader elections bill that would have made it more difficult to implement Prop 31 if it passed. I think Missouri banned ranked choice voting outright. Florida banned it outright. So it's like, even if the voters want it, they're writing in prohibitions for it before the voters have a chance to know what it is.
Right. This was the year where the most states banned ranked choice voting. Now we're at a total of 10 states. There are some other states that are looking to do it, like Missouri. It's on the ballot, and they've added a prohibition on non-citizens voting to that same proposition, which is already against the law.
Yeah.
But it's ballot candy to get the ranked choice voting ban passed. And by the polling that was done in September, which admittedly was done by a Republican leaning group, it looked like that had a lot of support. But you're right. When it comes to these type of efforts by voters, there will always be the people in power who will try to then get in the way. Like in Idaho, also, we've had Republican lawmakers say, well, if voters pass Amendment 1, which is the top 4 with ranked choice voting in that state, we'll just repeal it. We'll repeal it in January. And it's insane to see this from both sides of the political aisle, for one thing, but also that just complete disregard for what voters want.
Absolutely. And then when they get into Congress, of course, they realize they can't get anything done in there.
Right.
And so, and I think that almost tees up what we wanted to talk about today, because I know you and I were trading emails ahead of recording this, and we both seem equally frustrated in the sheer volume of coverage around polls at the expense of pretty much everything else. Like it's almost as if the press has given up on covering this as a legitimate race where voters are making a decision,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just covering like the score effectively. And I don't blame them, because in a lot of ways the only person running for president here is Harris,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like everybody kind of knows what they're getting with Trump, and they also know that like a lot of what he says is just nonsense. Like
Right.
so I don't know if you heard his speech or his talk at the Economic Club of Chicago.
I heard some of it. Yeah.
He's heard it, yeah. So he's being interviewed, and he went on this long diatribe about Virginia cleaning up its voter rolls and how the Justice Department sued them over this. Really, like, goes on with this long rambling story about it. And then the interviewer had to remind him that the question was about pursuing antitrust actions against Google. Right? So the guy, he doesn't answer the right questions. When he does, they're not factually correct, and there just seems to be this inability or this total lack of desire to try and cover that as an issue at all, because I think it's assumed a certain number of people are just going to vote for him no matter what. Harris, on the other hand, is being, at least what I've seen of coverage, if it's not about the polls, it's about what she's doing to affect them. How is she campaigning? Where is she campaigning? But nowhere in this picture is, what does this mean for Americans? And I think if I have to go back and find one point in time that really summarizes the state of this race, it was during the only debate between Harris and Trump. And Trump started shooting off at the mouth about Springfield, Ohio, right? Talking about how Haitian migrants are eating cats and dogs, which, it goes without saying, is debunked, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, Harris, in turn, calls him extreme, which was correct, but I think missed a real opportunity here, because the issues in Springfield, Ohio are national issues. These are issues that everyone's experiencing, and I'll just give you a few.
Mm-hmm.
So, over the last 6 years in Springfield, Ohio, the number of ESL students enrolled in Springfield Public Schools has increased 3x, right? 300%. That means the district has to spend money hiring ESL teachers at the expense of other expenses. Housing prices have increased.
Mm-hmm.
Rent prices have increased due to the increase in population. There are longer wait times at clinics. Governor Mike DeWine recently introduced mobile health clinics to alleviate the problem. These are real problems, and these are things every American cares about. What do Americans care about? They care about healthcare. They care about education. They care about the rising cost of housing. This was an opportunity for Kamala Harris to speak to those Americans who might still be undecided and might still be asking, what's in it for me? And
Mm-hmm.
instead, she just pointed Donald Trump as extreme.
And when I look at the media's coverage and particularly with this race, I think when we talk about how no one is really speaking to the heart of issues, that obviously does affect coverage. Like what are they going to cover if neither of the candidates are really speaking to the heart of these issues? But at the same time, we see that negative coverage is kind of the gold standard now for election coverage in general. And when you have a race where, let's face it, one of them is not a serious candidate. You know, that's what the one charge that Kamala Harris has made about Trump that is true, is that he's just not a serious candidate versus just one major party candidate. And so when you have this situation where you have one candidate just spouting out constant nonsense, when you're the media, you have this idea of fair and balance. Well, if we are going to cover the Haitians are eating or cats and dogs in Springfield, then we have to, on the other side, say, well, Kamala Harris isn't speaking enough to policy. And then when she comes out the bullet points, they have to be able to move that goalpost a little more, saying she's not giving out enough detail, right? And you have to feed the negative cycle of coverage on both ends, because we have adopted this and I think it's a very weird concept of fair and balance, where You just have to lower everyone down to the same level. And in a sense, that normalizes someone like Trump, which I don't think we should do, but it also doesn't really get into the heart of what journalism should be, and that is inform the electorate, educate the electorate. If the candidates aren't going to do it, then this is an opportunity for journalists to do it. Although I know the critique is going to come, well, they're going to play sides if they give information that seems like it favors one side or the other. Whatever, their job is to educate the public on what's going on. Yeah.
So Pew Research actually did a report on news coverage in the 2020 election. And what they noted was almost 70% of media coverage during the 2020 election focused on the horse race, focused on polls, prediction, candidate strategy, effectively whether they were going to get into office and not what they were going to do when they got there. And only about 30% of coverage delved into policy positions, but also personal backgrounds, public records. So it wasn't all policy. It was also like who they are outside of whether they're going to win or not. Knight Foundation did a similar study back in 2016. And what they noticed is that the tone of coverage was largely negative. So in the 2016 election, coverage for both candidates' fitness for office was 87% negative, right? 87% of the coverage for both candidates regarding their fitness for office was negative. And so, in a lot of ways, I think it fuels this cycle of cynicism and hopelessness while it's also feeding partisan panic. Mm-hmm. So, if you're a pro-Harris or an anti-Trump person, you are worried about autocracy, you are worried about mass deportations, you are worried about trade wars. And if you're an anti-Harris or a pro-Trump person, you are worried pretty much all on open borders. Like that's the big focus right now. There are throngs of pet-eating criminals just pouring over the Mexican border. And I think what it does is it makes a choice, like you can have this person who's crazy, or you can have this person who's probably not going to do anything. Mm-hmm. And I think we have a string of unfulfilled promises to back that up, whether it's Trump's unbuilt border wall or whether it's Biden's thwarted effort at canceling student debt.
I would venture to say that is why poll after poll, Kamala Harris on Fox News was asked about the 70 some odd percent of Americans who say the country is headed in the wrong direction. Almost every year, an overwhelming majority of Americans say we're headed in the wrong direction. And it doesn't really matter who's in office. Trump's in office, Biden's in office. Americans consistently say we're just headed in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. And you have to ask yourself how much of that has to do with the perception of where our country's at. And then also the fact that, what the retiring members of Congress are speaking to about how we just have a government that's locked in perpetual gridlock between two sides that have to win.
Yeah. I roughly calculate those numbers as 40%, 40%, and 20%, where 40% are more or less baked into the Democrats, 40% baked into the Republicans, and then there's these 20% in the middle that the majority of which align or regularly vote with either party. But what I'm hearing from the people who have decided to vote for Trump, who are voters who are up for grabs, these are people who voted for Biden in 2020, is it's really sort of like an FU. It's like, we know who Trump is, we know what he is, but you've had 4 years and you haven't delivered, and my grocery bills are higher and housing is more unaffordable, and maybe this will just send you a message. It's, to be frank, it's the same thing that got him into power in 2016, mm-hmm. right? Same exact sentiment. I think the people who pushed Trump over the edge were the people who were trying to send a message to those in power. And right. The message doesn't seem to have been delivered yet. Because even though Trump has ramped up his rhetoric continuously, and let's be fair, like Biden and Harris have both told voters a lot of what they want to hear. The reality on the ground is government continuously fails to deliver. The reality is we can barely keep the government funded. We can't pass a bill that's going to address immigration reform. And the reason for that is the polarization in Congress. And so one of the things I tell everybody is there is no issue you care about that will be resolved until we address the structural issues that enable polarization.
Right.
And that is why Michael Bennett is an idiot.
Yeah.
Period.
So yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Right? And I say the same thing, and I write about this a lot, about how any issue you care about, the economy, immigration, especially if immigration's a big issue for you this election, understand that tough, like whether you believe in tougher border security or a more compassionate immigration system for people who want to come here trying to escape desperate situations, or a melding of both ideas where we can have both, it's not going to happen, because both sides are entrenched in their own partisan politics, and the reason for that is because of the system in which they get elected. We talked about this in the last episode with the Unite America study that showed that only 7% of voters decide 87% of elections in this country. That is mind-boggling, and I think more and more voters are becoming aware of this, which is why, one, you're seeing more dissatisfaction with the two major parties and more people wanting to identify as independent. But also, it's no coincidence that we have 7 ballot measures on the ballot this year that address systemic election reform, in my opinion. I don't think there is a coincidence to that. And they all focus on the most critical stage of the elections process, which is the primary elections, which in most cases is what decide the outcome of the race. So whoever wins the majority party's primary is the one who ends up winning the election anyway. So making sure that people have the opportunity to have access to these taxpayer-funded elections is important. And that is how you shift the incentive structure to make candidates, actually force candidates to speak to a broader electorate. And I think that's something that voters should keep in mind when they see negative news coverage, when they see news coverage that isn't really talking about policy, when they see candidates on the stump not really talking about policy and just rambling about how their opponent is extreme or rambling about complete nonsense. Just keep that in mind. What you're seeing here, these two candidates that you're seeing running for president, are a product of the system that we have today.
And we are going to leave it there. Thank you for listening in. If you liked this episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate it, and leave it a review. And as always, if you did not like this episode and could keep it between us, that would be great. We will be back next week. Thank you again for listening to Middleweight Politics. Stay purple.